Freedom Knows No Color. Chapter 2. Abigail Whitney stepped forward and said to the overseer, "Never mind, Mr. Horton. I don't want them going to my brother damaged. The scamp will be caught. He can't have gone far. Tell my brother I'll send him when we catch him." The old woman turned to Julian then and said, "You need not look smug. I'll have the last laugh. I've sent word to my brother that you're rebellious and you'll need severe treatment to break your wicked spirit. You might have been Edward's pet, but you'll be Cyrus's whipping boy. That I know for sure." Julian climbed onto the wagon with Daniel and Uncle Jeb. He fought back tears as he watched the only home he'd ever known disappear from sight. He had never understood why Mrs. Whitney despised him so. Through the years, Mr. Whitney had always managed to spare Julian from her wrath. That had been enough to make his life relatively happy. But now the old woman was sending him north, into an unknown that Julian feared with all his heart. The wagon rumbled through the cypress and tulipo swamps, then past the freshwater swamps. Finally, it reached the valley of the Red River where cotton was grown. The next day, they reached the cotton plantation. Julian and the others were immediately taken to the big log house that served as the slave quarters. The house was a far cry from the snug little cabins at the Whitney farm. Julian noticed big cracks between the logs. He knew that when it rained, it would be miserable within those walls. A slave named Nat showed them where they would sleep. "We sleep on wooden planks?" Daniel asked in dismay. "Well, we used to bring in moss to make it softer," Nat said. "But then the fleas came. We couldn't get any rest for the fleas eating us alive." Julian thought longingly of the comfortable beds at the Whitney farm. "What do you get to eat here?" Daniel asked. "Corn and bacon," Nat replied. "Every Sunday morning we get enough corn to make a peck of meal, and we get 3.5 pounds of bacon. We have to make it last all week, because there's no more till Sunday comes again." Julian listened numbly to the details. He had not yet met Cyrus Cannon, but he was already desperate. He wished he had gone with Thomas. Whatever happened couldn't have been worse than this beastly existence. That night, Julian couldn't sleep. He rolled from side to side on the wooden plank, trying to find a comfortable position. In the darkness, Nat whispered, "Don't worry, boy. Once the work starts, you'll be so tired, you'll be able to sleep on nails." Julian sighed and thought about the times he had gone fishing with Ed Whitney. Julian and Howard and some of the other boys would rise before dawn. They'd all pile into a wagon, and Mr. Whitney would take them to a nearby river. There, they'd pull catfish and bullheads out of the water and fry them over an open fire. When they grew tired of fishing, they'd strip off their clothes and dive into the river, splashing and roughhousing. It hadn't seemed much like slavery then. It was his life, and he accepted it. He couldn't remember ever longing for freedom the way he did now. But since Mr. Whitney had died, it seemed that's all he'd thought of. As anger stirred within Julian, the injustice of what had happened to him and Daniel and Uncle Jeb rankled him like a raw wound. He remembered Aunt Sally pleading for Uncle Jeb. Now the two were torn apart and would probably never see each other again. How could anyone sell human beings like chickens and hogs? He wondered bitterly. Julian had still not slept when the horn sounded, signaling the start of a new day. There was a mad scramble to make breakfast and to fill gourds with water for use during the day. Then to fill another gourd with cornmeal cake and bacon for the midday meal. If you didn't get it all done quickly, you'd go into the fields unprepared. "Hurry along," Nat advised Julian. "You get caught here in the quarters after daybreak, you'll get a flogging." Julian ate his cornmeal cake and rushed into the fields with the others. Daniel had hurried out with him, but Uncle Jeb was nowhere in sight. At first, Julian worried, but then he reasoned that Uncle Jeb was an old man. They knew he would probably not be able to keep up. They must have found something else for him to do. It was March, and the ground was all prepared for the cotton crop. The mules had plowed 6-foot-wide beds. Now a mule pulled by a plow down the center of each bed, drilling holes. The women had sacks of cottonseed around their necks, as they dropped a seed in each hole. Another mule followed with a harrow to cover the seed. Julian soon saw that it took 2 mules and 3 slaves to plant a row of cotton. Julian had worked with mules before and was glad when he was given the job of running a plow. At first he was able to keep up with the others. Within a few hours, however, he was exhausted by the fast pace of the work. He wasn't used to it. He breathed a deep sigh of relief when it was finally lunchtime. But he couldn't believe it when Mr. Horton shouted, "You've got 10 minutes to eat! No more than that! No lagging now!" 10 minutes? At the Whitney farm they were always given half an hour, sometimes more. Julian wolfed down his meal. He felt like one of the mules, driven to endless toil, working until it dropped. He had never been so tired. In the days that followed, the work only got worse. The cotton plants appeared in a little more than a week. Now the slaves labored down the rows, hoeing out the weeds. It was when the hoeing started that Julian finally met Cyrus Cannon. Cannon was a huge man whose muscles seemed to strain against his clothes and high boots. His face was lined deep from the sun, and he had large, crooked teeth and pitiless eyes. He wore his blond hair long, and a straggly beard hung from his chin like Spanish moss. Now Cannon sat astride a nervous bay horse and seized up the slaves. His gaze went from slave to slave, as if he could measure the worth of each day by a single look. His hard stare landed on Julian. "You'd be Julian from my sister's farm," he said. "Yes, sir, Master Cannon," Julian said immediately, never meeting the other man's eyes. A sneer touched the man's thin lips as he pulled out a whip. "You look pretty fast to me, Julian. I want you to take the lead row." Frightened, Julian walked to the lead row and began working as fast as he could. During the hoeing, overseers on horseback rode behind the slaves, whipping those who lagged behind. Mr. Cannon took that role himself now, riding behind Julian as Julian wielded the hoe. Julian thought he was moving fast, but it was not fast enough for Cannon. The sting of the whip suddenly jolted Julian's body. Julian had never felt the whip before. The shock was almost worse than the pain. He stumbled, then righted himself and began hoeing at a frantic pace. "You are one slow darky," Cannon yelled. Again the whip fell, goading Julian on. The faster he went, the closer Cannon came to him. Julian could feel the hot breath of the horse on his neck. Cannon cursed Julian and cried, "Faster, boy!" At the end of the row, Cannon's big horse wheeled. "Well," Cannon said, "you're not as balky as Abigail led on. You'll make a fine field hand when I get down with you." Julian felt a rush of hatred that shocked him with its power. At that minute, he could easily have dragged Cyrus Cannon from his horse and hurled him into the river. Julian had never felt such hatred. He had disliked Mrs. Whitney, but Mr. Whitney had always stood between Julian and the woman's hostility. Now it was only Julian and Cyrus Cannon. Cannon, sneering through his crooked teeth, wielded the whip with glee. Cannon, like the kind of devil arson from the flames of hell. There was nobody, nothing to stop him. The slaves finally dragged themselves back to the quarters at sundown, but there were still the regular chores to do. It was Julian's job to chop wood for the cabin for the next day. With his muscles aching and his back still sore from the whip, he cut a load of wood. Then he carried as much as he could back to the log house. There, he found Daniel grinding corn in a hand mill for the next day's meal. Nat was sitting beside him, repairing a hoe handle. "The real work starts when the cotton comes up," Nat warned as he worked. "That's the time you work so hard you think you're going to die. No, you're sure you're going to die. They lash you so hard the first day so you pick a whole lot of cotton. That's how they know how much you can really do. And every day after, they weigh what you pick. And it's better not to be less than what you picked that first day, or you get whipped for lagging behind." Julian made a final trip to the woodpile in the moonlight to get another armload of wood. That was when he saw the man lying against a fence. Julian looked hard and made out Jeb. His back was against the post, and his legs were stretched out before him on the ground. "Jeb, what are you doing over there?" Julian asked, headed toward the old man. "They put me to cutting wood all day, Julian," Uncle Jeb said, grimacing and clutching his hand to his heart. "And then they sent me out again after dinner. But this time my legs done quit on me. I got so tired I just couldn't move. And I got this powerful pain going through me now. I thought if I sat a while it'd pass, but it hasn't." Jeb, what can I do for you? Julian asked. I don't figure there's much you can do, Julian, Jeb said. I expect my heart is quitting on me. I've been a slave a long time, boy. Before I came to the Whitney farm, I worked a big plantation, and it was hard, hard work. I'm worn out now, boy. Jeb, how can I help you? Julian wanted to know. You've always been so good to me. Uncle Jeb breathed hard. Then he said, Boy, there's one thing you can do to help me. How? Julian asked anxiously. The old man seemed to be fading fast. Just tell me what it is. When I go, you make sure they dress me in my best clothes, Uncle Jeb began. I got a dark suit in among my things. It's not a fancy suit, but it's the best I got. He paused for a moment, trying to control his raspy breathing. Then he continued. And I know there won't be no preacher saying words over me, so if you'd say some words... What do you want me to say, Jeb? Julian asked. Just say, Lord, take Jeb Sampson to the gates of glory and let him rest there in heaven. Julian nodded. I'll do that, Jeb, he said sadly. He could feel his eyes filling with tears. I'll see that you're dressed in your best suit, and I'll say those words. The old man's trembling hand found Julian's then and grasped it. Listen close now, boy. Tomorrow, at this time, I'll be gone. Nothing more anybody can do to these old bones. But sometime, if you want to make a run for it, if you want to take your chances. He began to cough then. It was a full minute before he could go on. Listen now, Jeb said. Julian leaned closer. Follow the river. Don't ever lose sight of the river. If you're going south to New Orleans, in about a night's walk you'll see a house, a big white house with oak trees and a big rooster weather vane on the roof. A white man lives there who's against slavery. They say he's crazy. He has wild gray hair and a long scraggly beard. Always wears a long black coat. But he's what they call an abolitionist. He'll help you, boy. You understand? Julian frowned. What was Uncle Jeb mumbling about? A white man who didn't like slavery? An abolitionist? Julian had never heard that word before. He paid little attention to what the old man said. All he could think of was what Uncle Jeb, his friend for his whole life, was sitting propped up against a fence post, dying outdoors like a dog. A man should die in bed, in his own home, surrounded by people who loved him. Jeb, can I fetch a doctor? Julian said. Jeb shook his head and sighed. I'm a goner, boy, but I wish you'd sing me a saving song before I go. Julian shook his head. I don't know any saving songs. Jeb was breathing in a shallow way now. Sing, steal away to Jesus. Steal away home. You know that one? Aunt Sally used to sing it while she worked in the kitchen. Julian remembered. He leaned close to Jeb and sang him the saving hymn. As he sang, he put his arm around Jeb and let the old man's head lie against his chest. He was holding Uncle Jeb in his arms, that way when a seizure wrenched his body. Then a surprised look came to Jeb's face. A trickle of saliva ran down his chin. His eyes closed and his chest ceased moving. And Julian knew that he was dead.